current temperature this morning. That's where we are. 16 degrees. And it's time to go to film school. Film study professor with us, my good friend Joe Fortunato, on board with us here at 93.5, 1590 WAKR. And we're going back to the 70s with a movie that has a cast that, quite frankly, just doesn't stop. And it was a very good movie, and it had its place in the, quote, disaster films. And I'm going to let Joe take it from there. Good morning, Joe Fortunato. Thanks for joining us again.
Good morning, Ray. Good morning, everybody. And yes, we're going back to the 70s, and we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Towering Inferno, which was released December 14th, 1974. It was directed by John Gillerman and sort of Irwin Allen. We'll talk about that in a moment. And you said it better than I. It's a long list of people, but the big stars, Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, William Holden, Faye Dunaway, Fred Astaire, O.J. Simpson, of course, and many others. This movie, I don't like the term guilty pleasure because I don't think we should feel guilty about any movie we love, but this sort of falls into that camp a little bit for me. But I wasn't alone because it was a very, very popular movie. It won 3 Oscars for cinematography, editing, and original song. It was nominated for 5 more, and it was the biggest grossing flick of 1974. It made over $100 million on its domestic run alone, earned back 10 times its production cost. It was the longest running of the 70s disaster flicks, which was sort of a cycle at that time. I'm going to take a shot at my beloved Jaws here, but this was the biggest box office hit before Jaws. And there's sort of an urban, I don't know if we call it an urban legend, but that Jaws was the first movie to break $100 million. And that's actually not true, because the Towering Inferno did it. Jaws was the fastest one to make it to $100 million, so kudos to my shark. But anyway, massive success of this film. There were 60 stunt people performing more than 200 stunts. Now, 20th Century Fox refused to let Irwin Allen, the great producer and the great disaster producer especially, they refused to let him direct all of the film. So Allen directed the action sequences, and John Gillerman was hired only to direct the actors for non-action sequences. So it was kind of an interesting split of duties there. The opening credits have a dedication that says, "To those who give their lives so that others might live, to the firefighters of the world." This picture is gratefully dedicated. And there were actually over 1,000 real firefighters that were hired throughout the entire production. The backstory of this is pretty interesting, actually, because it was based on 2 novels, one called The Tower by Richard Martin Stern, and the other called The Glass Inferno by Thomas Scorsia. And you can see where The Tower and The Glass Inferno were melded together to create The Towering Inferno. But after the success of the Poseidon Adventure in 1972, disaster was a very hot property. And anyway, so they acquired these rights. Warner Brother acquired the rights to one of the books, and Fox acquired the other one. So instead of kind of going into a battle of similar movies, they decided to pool their resources together. And this is one of the first, if not the first, co-productions of 2 big studios. The novels actually were inspired by the construction of the World Trade Center in the early 70s, and what could happen if a fire was in a skyscraper. So that's, a little bit sad in terms of the origin of what we all know happened, but still interesting. And it was the first, like I said, joint production, Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox.
Joe, you mentioned the cast for a moment, and it kind of really puts the stamp on the success and the popularity of those disaster films of the 70s. You mentioned the Poseidon Adventure, there was Airport and such, but I mean, when you're putting a movie together, when you got A-liners of McQueen and Newman and Holden and Faye Dunaway, and you could go on, that tells you that these actors and actresses, they wanted to be part of this era of these disaster films.
Well, they definitely did, but not without their top billing or top salary, because there was a lot of skirmishes behind the scene with agents and stuff. Steve McQueen's primary concern when he was filming was that his helmet made him look like an idiot. There was consternation in the Steve McQueen camp when they discovered that Paul Newman had 12 more lines of dialogue than he did. And probably more famously is the credits that they couldn't decide who would get top billing, Paul Newman or Steve McQueen. So they're actually staggered in the opening credits, meaning that one of the names is higher than the other and one is to the left. So it depends if you read it top to bottom. That person is the top billing. If you read it left to right, that person is the top billing. And that was called First Place Above and Below in the movie industry, and that kind of started that. Both Paul Newman and Steve McQueen were paid the same, $1 million and 10% of the box office. Now, what's interesting is that William Holden wanted top billing, but his career was not at the top of his game. So what he settled for was more percentages of the profits, and so he ended up making the most of anybody because of that. There was some fun, possible casting. Steve McQueen suggested that Clint Eastwood, Jack Nicholson, or Robert Redford be his co-lead instead of Paul Newman. For the role that went to Faye Dunaway, names that were considered were Catherine Ross, Raquel Welch, and Natalie Wood. Charlton Heston, Sean Connery, Rod Taylor were also considered for the role of the fire chief. So even though we do get a almost literal who's who of Hollywood stars, there were still a lot of big names sort of left on the cutting room, or not cutting room because they never shot, but that were considered for roles. Fred Astaire, this was his first Oscar nomination, and it's not a musical, so it's kind of interesting the way that worked out for him.
The Towering Inferno, one of the top films of 1974, one of the highest grossing films, as Joe mentioned, very popular. And that blueprint, Joe, and you talked about it, Poseidon Adventure, Airport, Towering Inferno, getting a lot of stars, disaster. You could take the Towering Inferno and put it underwater, right? And you'd have the Poseidon Adventure.
Exactly. Let me just share something with you. Last summer, we had the Barbenheimer phenomenon where we had Barbie and Oppenheimer sort of being shown together or screened together. Well, the Towering Inferno and Earthquake, which was also in 1974, were released only a month apart in 1974. So some theaters showed both movies as a double feature and promoted it as the Shake and Bake double feature.
That's a great way to end. Joe, great stuff this morning. Always appreciate the time. You can check out our Film School with Joe Fortunato at WAKR.net, WAKR.net. Joe, thanks a lot for the time, my friend. We'll reconnect next Friday.